Fabric collections, often referred to as stashes, can elicit all sorts of feelings. Ideally, our fabric stash is a source of inspiration that gets our creative juices flowing. But for some of us, especially when the amount we own is out of sync with the speed at which we sew, we might grow to feel uncomfortable, embarrassed, or even guilty about the resources that we've accumulated. So this week and next week, we are continuing the Fabric Stash Reduction mini-series with a practical deep dive into how to do it, so you can reach a point where your fabric stash feels well stocked, but not overwhelming. But everyone is different, so I can't deliver a one-size-fits-all step-by-step guide to reducing your stash, because what will work for one person might not work for you, or for me. But what I can do is collate and share with you what worked for lots of other people. So stick around and we'll get into it. Welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 16 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But, like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and I'm looking at the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. And I really hope you'll join me in this journey. Hi lovely one, are you doing okay? Thank you for pressing play on this episode. If you're challenging yourself for Me Made May, I hope you have a wonderful and illuminating challenge and that you learn lots of useful lessons that inform your making going forwards. I also hope that you take every opportunity to celebrate your creativity and your handmade achievements. Another thing going on in May is No Mow May, which is an annual campaign initiated by the wild plant charity Plant Life, and it encourages people to refrain from mowing their lawns in May. This pause in mowing allows wildflowers to grow and bloom, providing vital food and shelter for pollinators like bees and butterflies. So if you yourself have a lawn that you're responsible for, could you pledge to not mow it for the month? Could you try and convince someone else in your life not to mow theirs, or at least not to mow it as often? Pollinators and other insects are so incredibly vital to our biodiversity and also our food security. We really need to be giving them a helping hand, and this is such a fuss-free way to do it, you know? So, having said that, I have a sustainability win for you of sorts that I'm afraid to say is actually at odds with No Mow May. So, as you probably know by now, I recently took on an allotment plot which was really overgrown. Well, kind of still is. So I've been digging and digging, trying to pull it into shape so I can grow stuff this year and also meet the rules of the allotment site that states you're meant to have 75% of the plot cultivated. So most of what I'm having to clear is grass and it's been pretty hard going. And I really need to cut back the grass that forms the paths to make it all just a lot more manageable. Now, because there's no power supply down the allotment site, I need to get hold of a cordless strimmer that's battery powered. And because I try to avoid buying new stuff wherever possible, especially something like a strimmer that I'll only use for a few times a year and would take up a lot of space, I was looking to hire one, but I've had no luck in my area. So as a second best option, I've been looking to buy one second hand, but there aren't currently any for sale in the places that I've looked, like Facebook Marketplace and eBay. I really don't want to buy a new one, so I just thought I'd see if I could borrow one. So I put a request out on the Olio app, and very sweetly, a lovely lady about 10 minutes away offered me hers to borrow. And I've just been to pick it up. I'm going to use it this weekend, and when I bring it back, I'm going to give her some of the rhubarb, which is pretty much the only thing currently ripe and ready to eat from the allotment. So yes, I'm having to ignore the No Mow May campaign, but my plot hasn't been mowed or trimmed for probably a couple of years at this point. Plus I've dedicated a big section down the side of the shed for wildlife where I've just piled up loads of twigs and stuff, and I'm just going to leave that alone. So I hope on balance my plot is still a haven for wildlife. No new patrons to thank this week. However, I do get to thank existing patron Vicky for upping the amount of their support. Much appreciated, Vicky. So I really hope you enjoy this week's episode and next week's, which is part 2, and will include lots more ideas, tips and tactics for successful fabric stash reduction. So until next week, take care of yourself, take care of the pollinators by doing what I say, not as I do, and don't mow your lawn, and enjoy. Fabric collections, often referred to as stashes, can elicit all sorts of feelings. Ideally, our fabric stashes are a source of inspiration that gets our creative juices flowing. But for some of us, especially when the amount we own is out of sync with the speed at which we sew, we might grow to feel uncomfortable, embarrassed, or even guilty about the resources we've accumulated. This mini-series on fabric stash reduction is not a judgment on anyone who owns fabric in any quantity. If your own fabric stash induces nothing but positive feelings, or predominantly positive feelings, then I'm super happy for you. These episodes are for those of us who would prefer to have a smaller fabric stash, a collection that size and contents better reflect what we like to sew and how often we get to do it. And for those of us who want a collection that doesn't induce guilt around the resources, energy and labour that we know went into its production. For those of us who need our fabric collection to fit into our physical space better. And for those of us who, when we walk into the room where it's kept, feel inspired rather than overwhelmed. Some of you might be thinking, if you want to own less fabric, just give lots of it away and stop buying more. But people acquire and own fabric for all sorts of complicated reasons, or for reasons that aren't even complicated. You might simply love beautiful textiles and can't resist buying them when you see them. Whatever the reasons for being in the position where you feel you own too much, it's rarely as easy as simply giving some away and stopping buying more. We will probably need a mindset shift, a habit change, and some tactics to implement. Everyone is different, so I can't give you a step-by-step guide to reducing your stash that's guaranteed to work, because what will work for someone might not work for you, or for me. But as your friendly neighbourhood podcaster, what I can do is collate and share with you what's worked for lots of other people. So in this week's and next week's episodes, we'll be hearing from lots of awesome Check Your Thread listeners who consciously, successfully reduced their fabric stash, and we'll hear what worked for them. If you're in the market for fabric stash reduction tactics, hopefully some of these submissions will resonate with you. A lot of the submissions I received when I put out the call came in written form. And so you don't get too sick of my voice, I asked Check Your Thread community member Lindsay Ashworth-Fraser, who happens to be a voiceover artist, to record some of them for me. How awesome is that? Enormous thanks to Lindsay for doing that for me. And of course, enormous thanks to anyone who took the time to submit a response. So what were they responding to? The prompt I set out was this. Why did you decide you wanted to or needed to reduce the amount of fabric that you owned? Was there a particular trigger? How did you approach reducing your stash? What practical steps did you take? Did you keep track of your progress at all? If so, what methods did you use? And is there anything else you'd like to add? So let's get into it. Let's start with a submission from Bridget, kindly voiced by Lindsay.
Bridget writes, I've never had a big stash. But last year, I came to the realisation that what I did have was actually putting me off sewing. I've had a lot of changes in my life in recent years, and almost everything I had in my stash was for projects I no longer wanted to make. It made sewing feel like an obligation rather than a joy. I pulled out all my fabric and hung it on hangers in my wardrobe. Seeing it all together made it easy to see what I had too much of and what I was never going to wear. I was then able to pass things on to friends and through fabric swaps, till I ended up with a small core of things I actually wanted to use. I've still got some stash, but now my ambition is not to add to it and keep resources in the shop till I'm ready to use them, though that doesn't always work.
That is such a clever idea, envisioning what the fabrics in your stash would look like when made up as garments that will eventually be in your wardrobe. This one is from Nikki, who makes the important point that stashed fabric isn't always in the form of a folded length of fabric, but it's still fabric.
Hi Zoe, Nikki Slade here from Westdean near Chichester. When I first saw your call out for this, I thought, I don't really have a stash. I'm more of a quilter than a garment sewer, although I do the odd garment. And I also enjoy upcycling things I bought from the charity shop. But then I thought, actually, what's in the boxes underneath my bed? I have a number of plastic boxes with things like men's shirts in and dresses that I've bought for the fabric. So yes, that's a stash. The last time I did a de-stash was when we thought we were moving house 3 years ago. Spoiler alert, we didn't, and we're still here. But because I had to get rid of it quickly, because it all seemed to be happening at the last minute, I used some of it to stuff a footstool thing, which I still have. and gave some of it to friends. A lot of it was scraps, and that ended up, I'm afraid, being put in a bag labelled rags and going to the clothes recycling. So I don't know how much that helps, but that's my de-stash situation. Okay, thanks. Bye.
This submission is from Catherine. Catherine writes, I always knew I had too much fabric, but since it was stored in the attic, it was a bit out of sight, out of mind. And the amount of fabric was useful when having to send children to school in what seemed like endless days of dress up for topic X. However, when we moved house, I was brought face to face with the ridiculous amount of fabric. My fabric was all stored in boxes, one for activewear, one for laundry wear, one for stretched knits, etc, etc. I went through each box and sold or gave away fabric for an imaginary life or a much younger version of myself. Really don't need that many evening dresses. I also got rid of a lot of glorious wool coating fabric. I seemed to buy so much that I could have made a new coat every year for about 10 years without running out. But I do not make a coat a year, and I don't need 10 wool coats either. I was then left with fabric that I knew I would use to sew myself or someone in the family clothes with, or fabric that would be useful for toiles or quilts. I also unsubscribed from any fabric shop newsletter. I joined the Last Sew Standing Challenge. I asked for fabric shop vouchers as birthday presents so I could buy fabric if I wanted, but aimed to use up my stash. I've been planning garments and matching them to existing fabrics and trying zero waste patterns to use up very small pieces. Too small for a traditional shirt pattern, but not too small for a zero waste shirt. I now have all my fabric in a cupboard and old garments for repurposing. So I can't buy more fabric until there is space. And I now only buy when I know which pattern I will use and when I'll actually get to sew it. I still have a lot of fabric though. I hear you, Catherine. Here's a submission from Andrea, read by Lindsay, sharing another equally determined and multifaceted approach to stash reduction.
Andrea writes, I did a big de-stash when we moved from the UK to France 7 years ago. I had fabric, wool and lots of patterns, books and magazines. In terms of how to triage, it was simply a question of deciding what I really loved and could foresee using, even if I didn't have a specific project in mind, and these things were kept. I was in quite an unsentimental frame of mind at the time, so this was not a difficult task. Most of the fabric that I didn't want was in small pieces, quite old, and I took it to the charity shop. Also, some to the scrap store, Gloucester Resource Centre, that provides all sorts of things for schools to use in arts and crafts. The knitting and sewing magazines I took to a local community cafe, where they had a knitting group and needed resources for the participants. I had a pretty good idea of what wool and pattern books would sell on Ravelry, and indeed I did quite well with that. A few things I sold to a person who had a clothes stall in an indoor antiques market. I think I raised a few £100 overall, so that was nice to have. And of course, a few nice things I gave to friends, knowing that they suited their particular styles. To be honest, it didn't need too much thinking. You do have to be organised if you're going to sell online, taking good photos, writing clear descriptions and uploading the details, and then keeping track of messages and posting things off promptly.
Here's a submission from Gail, who has developed a clever system that they've designed that works particularly well with the type of fabrics that they tend to collect.
My name is Gail, and I live in Houston in the U.S. Reducing my stash is an ongoing process, which is informed by how I acquired each piece. I buy most of my fabric secondhand, but I do so only if I'm inspired by the fabric. It either brings to mind a project, or it is just beautiful in some way. If a piece loses its power to inspire, it gets donated. I do have a defined space, part of a closet, that houses said fabric. So when it threatens to spill out, it's time to evaluate and reduce. I keep track of all the pieces in a set of small staple-bound notebooks. One fabric swatch per page usually, along with date, amount, cost, notes about pre-washing, and a burn test. Then when it gets used, I go back and note that and possibly what it was used for. Because the books are chronological, when it's time for a clean-out, I can go first to the oldest book and see what is still in my stash and what can go. I'm lucky to have 2 creative reuse centers I can just donate the fabric back to if I'm not going to use it and I'm done being inspired by it. My goal is to maintain good feelings about the fabric as a library or a collection, thus no feelings of hoarding or being weighed down by it. So far, this has worked for me.
So clever! The notebook system, whether analogue or digital, is a great way to keep on top of what you own and the ideas that you had for each piece, that you can then easily reference without getting the physical lengths of fabric out. Here's another submission kindly read by Lindsay, this time offered up by listener Donna.
Donna writes, "My stash busting was precipitated by a move to a new country and the cost of shipping. Although I realise now that anything I made and then took with me didn't save on any costs. I don't have a big stash, but I had some uncut fabrics that had been in it for a few years. So I decided to hunt for patterns specifically for the fabric and get on with sewing. I told myself that even if they didn't turn out perfect, I would be reducing the fabric volume. I also looked for projects to use up remnants. As I sew with a lot of technical fabrics, knickers, bras and bikinis were excellent ways to achieve this goal. Also helped that I moved to Spain. I didn't keep track as such as I didn't have a huge amount to use. Hope this is helpful."
I love how Donna gave themselves the permission to just use the fabric by reminding themselves that the results don't have to be perfect. So let's wrap up today's instalment on the topic of fabric stash reduction with a voice note from Polly, which is another reminder that it's okay to just use the fabric.
Hi Zoe, it's Polly Fur in Portland, Oregon, responding to your request about using stash fabric in a recent project. At first I thought not to do that. It wasn't appropriate for me to answer because I'm not consciously trying to reduce my stash. Here's what I'm consciously trying to do: not buy any more fabric and use what I have. And the main thing I did with this project, which is what I think might be useful for someone else to hear, is that I have a thrifted tablecloth that's been in my stash, and, it's kind of nice, so I thought I might save it for a project, not just a toile, but save it for a real project. And so I've been hesitant to cut into it, and I wanted to make a second pair of jeans to test out the final, what I am considering the final adjustments on my master jeans pattern. And, I'm wondering, is that the right thing to use? Is it going to be okay? And the important part is that I just went ahead and did it. I went ahead and cut up that fabric instead of trying to say, is this the highest and best use? And shouldn't I save this for later, etc.? So right now I'm working on a pair of jeans that are from a pale pink tablecloth with white dots. And so far it's working out great, and I'm glad I decided to use it. Thanks for your work. Bye-bye.
Thanks again everyone who shared their experiences and motivations for reducing their fabric stashes. And thanks again to Lindsay for helping express them. You can find a link to Lindsay's Instagram in the show notes. The next episode is along the same lines, where we'll hear more tales of successful fabric stash reduction. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!